How do you think you would respond if you witness an incident of sexual harassment unfold in front of your eyes? There is obviously more than just one way in which you can choose to respond, and this would depend on several factors. In our previous video, we talked about the possible decision making processes that may go on in the mind of an observer. But what are the possible actions that the observer takes once they've evaluated an incident and decided to intervene? And what is the relation between an observer's choice of intervention and the survivor's behavioral response? So before we explain the kinds of observer interventions, we shall highlight some of the behavioral responses displayed by survivors of sexual harassment in the workplace and the motivations behind such responses. Now this is important to understand because the decision-making process of an observer is often contingent upon the reactions and behavior of the survivors themselves. In this series, we have talked about the need for accepting passive survivors of sexual harassment as survivors who need to be supported instead of being ostracized. Passive responses, though extremely common, fall into one class of responses studied by researchers who investigate sexual harassment in the workplace. So what are the other kinds of responses survivors are known to display? Professor Deborah Knapp and others introduced a typology of responses to classify the common types of responses displayed by survivors. This typology depends on two features. First, the focus of the target. The target can choose to focus on themselves in order to cope with the sexually harassing behavior, or choose to turn their focus on the harasser in order to put a stop to the harassment. The second feature is defined by the level of agency shown by the survivor. They either decide to cope and respond completely by themselves, or they seek help from others to cope and take action against the harasser. Combining these two features results in broadly four types of responses survivors are known to display in the face of sexual harassment, out of which the first two types of responses are more passive, whereas the last two involve proactive measures taken by the survivor against the harasser. Let us take a look at the first one. As we said earlier, this is the most common type of response among survivors. It involves altering the job situation by quitting or transferring, ignoring the harassing behavior, or downplaying it. This is a coping response that is self-focused and involves little to no outside support. It is common when the target fears a threat of retaliation or in organizations where sexual harassment is commonplace. The second behavioral response is social coping. This is another self-focused response. It does not involve proactive measures taken by the target to stop the harassment. Instead, the target seeks support from external agents to address the incident. For example, some targets will bring along a friend whenever they believe the perpetrator will be present. Survivors may also build a support structure by discussing their experiences with sympathetic others, such as peers, co-workers, and family members. The use of medical or emotional counseling also qualifies as social coping, since it is a self-focused response that includes the support of others. Again, although it is not particularly effective in stopping the harassment, counseling may assist the individual in diffusing the event and finding more effective solutions to the problem. Next comes confrontation. This includes responses that are negligible in terms of the use of outside support, but are initiator focused because they involve addressing the perpetrator directly. For instance, the target can ask the harasser to stop, or if they are in a position to do so, threaten them. While this may seem to be a very effective strategy, the very real threat of retaliation and possible consequences, especially if the harasser is in a powerful position, can deter the target from standing up directly to the harasser. Assertive responses can also take a considerable emotional toll on the survivors. It is no surprise then that confrontation is a path less taken by sexual harassment survivors. The final response in this typology is what the researchers called advocacy seeking. The target can be assertive by filing formal complaints against the harasser. In organizations in which sexual harassment is not tolerated, this is an effective strategy since the organization takes tangible action against the harasser and extends its support to the target. However, if this is not the case, then the incident can be swept under the rug or the organization can be lenient to the harasser. Advocacy seeking also includes approaching external bodies like social organizations and judiciary bodies for legal action against the harasser. Finally, survivors may turn to their colleagues, requesting them to intervene when they are facing sexually harassing behavior. A common observation is that survivors progress sequentially through this typology, from the most self-focused, low-intervention coping techniques to the more perpetrator-focused, high-intervention techniques. Evidence suggests that targets typically confront or report the harasser only after their more self-focused methods have failed to end the behavior. Now let us turn our attention to an observer who has decided that the harassing situation requires their intervention. Like behavioral responses at the target, researchers have classified the intervening behavior of the observer along two dimensions of immediacy and level of involvement. The immediacy of involvement could be low or high. A high immediacy involvement means stepping in when the harassing situation is taking place in front of them. A low immediacy involvement means intervening after the episode, for instance, by either confronting the harasser at a later time or by reporting the incident. The second dimension is the level of involvement displayed by the observer. This could be high, mild, or no involvement at all. In case of no involvement, the observer does not perceive the situation as sexual harassment. A mild involvement would look like them privately consulting the target and so keeping themselves publicly out of the sexually harassing incident. In high involvement interventions, the observer immerses themselves in the situation publicly, which increases the potential of resultant personal risks and benefits. So again, we have four broad classes of observer interventions depending on the combination of immediacy and involvement. So what do these intervening responses look like? And what kind of situations lead to each of these responses? Let us try to answer these questions using real life examples. High immediacy, high involvement intervention would be where the observer publicly confronts the harasser by telling them to stop the harassment or publicly encouraging the target to report the incident. The common denominator in all these actions is that the observer takes an active and public role in the incident. A high immediacy, high involvement intervention by an observer is more likely when there's very little ambiguity in the sexually harassing incident and the observer feels very strongly about the incident. Observers also tend to highly involve themselves if they're in a powerful position in the organization or they feel a sense of personal responsibility and when the risks of intervention are low. However, public interventions can also have self-serving motives like attempting to look good in front of others. A low immediacy, high involvement intervention can include whistleblowing or offering to accompany the target as they report the incident. We call interventions high immediacy, low involvement when the observer interrupts an ongoing harassment situation without alluding to the harassment explicitly because they do not want to be embroiled in the matter. Such interventions are likely when the harasser is in a more powerful position compared to both the target and the observer. So the observer does make efforts to end the harassment, but not via a confrontational stand that would pull them into conflict. Finally, an observer may try to covertly keep the target away from the harasser or privately advise them. The key characteristics of these low immediacy, low involvement behaviors are that observers do not become party to the harassment incident and they occur after the harassment incident. These intervention types are not mutually exclusive and an observer may engage in more than one kind of intervention depending on the episode of sexual harassment and the frequency of these incidents. High involvement interventions are the most helpful to sexual harassment survivors. However, high involvement interventions are infrequent and often for similar reasons as that for passively responding to sexual harassment. Even if the observer perceives the situation as having little ambiguity, fear of retaliation, especially if the harasser is in a powerful position, may discourage an observer from intervening. Low involvement strategies, on the other hand, may help the survivor to cope with the sexual harassment, but it is unlikely to put an end to the harassment. So, what are the measures that an organization as a whole can take to increase the chances of intervention? How can organizations reduce the costs of whistleblowing? To find out, tune into the next episode.